So incidental take. People have a lot of questions about incidental take and take in general. So let's talk a little bit about take. Incidental take and take in general is a term that confuses a lot of people, and there's a lot of nuances to it. But generally speaking, Section 9 of the Act has a whole list of what it calls prohibited acts. Some of those prohibited acts are related to the plants, and some of them are for fish and wildlife. One of the prohibited acts for fish and wildlife is referred to as take, and so that's where that term comes from. Take in the Endangered Species Act actually has a number of words that define it. Words like harm, harass, capture, trap, chase, these kinds of things. Two of those terms, harm and harass, the Fish and Wildlife Service has promulgated a regulation to give a fuller definition to those words. And so that basically encompasses take, and take is prohibited under Section 9 of the Act.
Okay, and so the fact that there are these prohibitions, how does the public work within the Act itself while still being able to continue its work?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a little complicated because it somewhat is dependent on the circumstance and the individual or group that needs to potentially do something that would be prohibited. So let's take a federal action agency, for example. Under Section 7 of the Act, a federal action agency has to ensure that its action is not likely to jeopardize a listed species. And so they do that through a consultation and a biological opinion from the Fish and Wildlife Service. As part of that process, if it's determined that the take of a listed species is likely to occur, but that it's take that's incidental, it's not purposeful, it just happens to occur because you're doing a particular project and it's going to end up taking a listed species, we can exempt that take in an incidental take statement, which would be attached to the biological opinion. So that's how a federal action agency would handle that situation. If it's not a federal action agency, if it's a county, a city, an individual, then the controlling section in the Endangered Species Act is Section 10. And Section 10 has two different types of permits that would allow for take. The first one we call a 10A1A permit. And that's a permit for, we also have a shorthand, we sometimes call that the scientific take permit. And that one is for when someone is actually going to purposely take a species, like a scientist might capture one, band it, turn it loose. Well, that obviously would be a violation of Section 9 take, but we can permit it if under certain conditions. The second circumstance, similar to the federal example I mentioned earlier, is what if a non-federal person or group is going to incidentally take a listed species. And we handle that under Section 10 also, only this time it's called Section 10A1B. In that case, to get a permit for that incidental take, we would go through what we call an HCP process, Habitat Conservation Plan process. And that would allow for permitting an otherwise prohibited take of a listed species. So those are the circumstances and the different mechanisms the Act has to allow work and activities to go forward while still being consistent with the Act.